Hey, Justin Dyson here, Dyson Apiaries. Today we're going to talk about feeding bees, and specifically we're going to talk about the methods of feeding bees on the hive. We're not going to talk about yard feeding today. That'll be a different video. Today we're going to talk about the different methods of feeding on the hive and the kind of the pros and cons of each different method. Stick right with us. Thank you. Okay, so there's a lot of different methods that we can use to get sugar water into our bees. Maybe it's for, maybe we're trying to promote brood rearing. Maybe we are trying to get them to draw comb. Maybe we are trying to get them prepared for winter. And we can talk about the different mixtures of sugar. We'll do that in a different video, but today I'm just going to talk about the methods of getting that sugar on the bees. So one of the feeders that everybody I'm sure has heard of is this, what we call the Boardman Feeder. And what this does is just a jar with a perforated lid, if we can see that. And you don't even have to buy these type of lids. You can just take a regular mason jar, poke a couple little holes in it, and the bees can get right to it. So the way this works is this piece here, it sits right in the entrance of the hive. I'll turn this a little bit. It sits right in the entrance there. And if we notice, this part is open right here. So the bees can come in from the hive and they can go up. And if we have this jar sitting right here, they can go up and they can get the sugar water out of the jar. How this works is this jar is sitting upside down, and we have a vacuum seal. So there's liquid inside the jar, and in order to displace the liquid, we have to refill the jar with air. So each time that the bee kind of draws a little bit of nectar off of there and they get a certain amount and there develops a certain amount of vacuum, at that point the jar would bubble and the pressure would be equalized. So that's kind of how that works. So let's talk about the advantages of it. Firstly, the advantages are we can see the feed. So it's sitting right on the front of the hive, and we can walk right by it and we can see that yes, they still have feed on them, or yes, they've taken a certain amount. We can see that visually right here. Second advantage is we don't have to go in the hive. We can just simply take this. There could possibly be bees here, so when we take it out, we'd be careful. Knock the bees off, refill the jar, put the lid back on, reset the jar. Second advantage. So we don't have to go into the hive. Now let's talk about disadvantages a little bit. So one of the disadvantages is, as we talked about, it's based off of the pressure within there. So if we take a sunny day, for example, we know that gases expand as they get hotter, and so if we have this sitting out here, and if our apiary is in the sun like it should be, as the sun hits this jar and heats that liquid up and that air and everything, it's going to start expanding. It will actually push the sugar water out, and it may be at a rate faster than what the bees can take. So we have to keep that in mind. Secondly, I'm sure everybody's probably heard that there's a risk of robbing with a Boardman feeder. And of course you can see that if we look in this hive and we think about this feeder here, there's only a 3/4 of an inch gap between where a robber bee could slide into this hive, go right around and get to the sugar water and slip right out, and they never have to go up into the brood nest or any of the other bees. So they have to, it's kind of limited the amount of bees they have to deal with to get to the sugar water. That's a pretty simple fix. If we think about a nuke, for example, these actually work pretty well on nukes. A nuke is only this wide, so that only leaves a small gap there, and it may even eliminate us having to put an entrance reducer in a nuke. But for a full hive, we can do something as simple as taking a 3/4 by 3/4 piece of wood. This is an entrance reducer, for example. It's 3/4 inch by 3/4 of an inch, which is what your entrance is. We can just take another piece of wood, rip it in 3/4 square, 2, 3, 4, 5 inches long, whatever you choose. Really does, you don't have to make it complicated. We can slide that right in. And now, if the bees come in, they're gonna have to go all the way across to get to that feeder. So that's kind of a quick, easy solution to trying to help with robbing when it goes to Boardman feeders. So not a terrible idea to use Boardman feeders. They're really cheap, and easy to come by. They're easy to refill and all of that good stuff. So not a bad choice. Maybe not the best choice, but not a bad choice. All right, so the next option I'm going to talk about is a frame feeder. This is just one example. There are multiple different styles and manufacturers of these. This one, for instance, has little floats that go in here. Some have screen wire that go in them. Some are 2 frames wide, some are 1 frame wide. So there's a lot of different variations of this. So what those floats do, of course, is kind of like the screen. So those floats kind of keep the bees from getting down underneath and drowning in the sugar water. And they sit on top of that float. They take the sugar water, and as the sugar water gets drawn down, the floats go down, of course. And the screen wire ones, they just go down the sides and back up, and the bees can crawl on that screen wire and not get stuck in the sugar water. So again, there are a couple different kinds. Some are 2 frames, some are 1 frame. But with these, we would simply remove 1 frame, and we would drop this feeder. We would drop this feeder right into the hive. So advantages of this feeder, as opposed maybe to the Boardman feeder, we can put quite a bit more liquid in here. They're pretty inexpensive as well. If you get the 2 frame feeders, you can get a couple gallons of feed in these, so not a bad choice. Disadvantages, for one, this is our hive and the bees are in it. Of course, we're going to have to go into the hive, so a lot of times we have to feed at night so that the bees don't rob. If we're feeding at night, bees don't like us opening them up at night, so sometimes that's a challenge, and so we do have to get to the bees. Other disadvantages, I don't really know any. It's not a bad feeding method. Works in nukes, works in 10 frame hives, doesn't matter. Not a bad choice. We could slide this, put it right against the cluster, even if this was, you know, if this hive was in this orientation, and say they only have 5 frames of bees, we could move frames and we could put this frame wherever it needed to be. So we'd put it right up against the cluster, maybe for emergency feeding. Another advantage would be, you know, it's not necessarily promoting robbing. So any robber bees would have to go all the way up into the hive and up over the top of the frame feeder and back down into it. So they're going to have to cross a lot of bees. So robbing, not a bad thing with a frame feeder. All right, so the third method I'm going to talk about is hive top feeders. And there's a lot of variations of this. So we see this one where we have the screen over the middle, and if we notice, there is a groove in the middle where the bees can come up out of the hive, up through the middle, then they can come up and over, and they can get to the syrup on either side. Another variation of that is it's in the front. So the bees here would have to go up. This would be in this orientation. The bees would have to come up through the front, up and over, and get to the syrup. Another variation of the first one I showed you is the plastic style instead of the wooden. And for these, you can take an old super that maybe got some rotten corners on it, and instead of throwing it in the burn pile, saw it down a little bit shorter. This little feeder slides right in there. So these are nice as well, and again, they come up through the middle of these, and the plastic, of course, it's not going to leak. So if we talk about these, let's take this lid off. So of course this feeder will go right on top. One of the things I like about this version as opposed to this version is, for instance, in the early spring when we're still having some cold nights and cold mornings, This one's kind of nice because the cluster, no matter if the cluster is toward the front of the hive or toward the back of the hive, they can typically reach the middle of the hive. As opposed to this one, they have to be able to reach with their cluster the front of the hive to get up through there. So that's one of the advantages I see between this one and this one. I prefer this one a little better. Now you do have to pour your syrup in 2 different compartments in this one, and this one is just 1 compartment. So we'll kind of stick with this one for talking points. One of the great things about this type of feeder is, as we see, it's got the screen over top of it. We put this on the hive, and we need to go feed these bees after dark. We take the lid off of this hive, and the bees cannot get to us. So we can take the lid off the hive, pour the syrup in. The bees are not going to get to us. They come over, they drink their syrup, and we're good. So we can feed at night, no issues. Other cool thing is that heat rises, and so again, if we're in early spring, as the heat rises from the bees, that heats this area up above their cluster and allows them to go up and into their feed. So it allows them to feed even when it may be a little chilly, as opposed to maybe a Boardman feeder on the front or even a frame feeder on the side. They can go straight up and get to their honey. Another advantage to this type of feeder is we can put a lot of syrup in here. So if we need to feed a lot of colonies and we don't have to want to go there every day, this is a great option. We can put several gallons of syrup into this type of feeder, and we don't have to go back every day. Disadvantages? Disadvantages? I can't really think of any with this other than cost. So if you're going to buy these feeders like this, they're going to cost you 20 bucks as opposed to a Boardman feeder that's going to cost you less than 5. So big difference in cost. If you're doing a lot of colonies, that gets pretty expensive to buy a lot of Hive Top feeders. The wooden version, disadvantage, sometimes they'll start leaking, and that is a mess when a Hive Top feeder starts leaking. You go around, you're filling up all your bees, and you walk back by one of the feeders and there's syrup running out the entrance of the hive. That is a disaster. You're gonna have robbing the next day. There's a lot of issues with that. So one disadvantage of the wooden, we can fix that. Typically it's the seams and they're just siliconed, so you can put some additional silicone in there, fix that feeder. That's one thing I like about the plastics. They never leak. As long as we keep them out of the weather and don't let water stand in here and rust out the screen, these feeders last forever. Keep them out of the sun. So these are pretty cool for that. So if we talk about all 3 feeders, we'll kind of recap a little bit. Boardman feeder, inexpensive. We have to be careful with robbing. Can't feed a lot of syrup. Division board feeder. We have to remove a frame. We can hold more syrup than the Boardman feeder, but not as much as the Hive Top feeder. And it's not right above the cluster if we're feeding in cooler weather. Last but not least, definitely not least, the Hive Top feeder. It's expensive. If we're buying a lot of these, it's a lot of money to buy a lot of Hive Top feeders. But the bees can get to them in cooler weather. We can hold a lot of syrup. We don't have to go back to these colonies as often to feed. Overall, these Hive Top feeders are my favorite. But when it comes to feeding nukes, the Boardman feeder is not a bad option. Thanks for tuning in. I hope you learned something about how we feed bees. If you'll subscribe to our channel, I'm going to talk about the different mixtures that we use in feeding and what times of year we use that. I'll be putting that video out soon. In addition, I'll talk about yard feeding and the pros and cons of yard feeding, how we can build some inexpensive yard feeders. Stay tuned on my channel. I'm going to give you some more information on that in the near future. Thanks for watching. Like, share, and subscribe. Thank you.